section is diving into what a health check or a rubric would look like in terms of helping teams understand what is our current situation, what's the area that we want to focus on, and providing a shared mental scaffold for people to work through a sort of series of work together, but also to do that in a non-prescriptive way so that people can choose their own adventure and focus on the things which are immediate priorities for their teams rather than going through a pre-formulated experience. So that's the first section. The second section is to go, okay, now that we've got a focus, what are we going to do about it? And again, this is going to be a non-prescriptive way around the idea of patterns or anti-patterns for organizing. So if we have a challenge around feedback, let's look at how other people have done feedback. Let's look at a bunch of different patterns for doing feedback in our team or increasing the amount of feedback or the accuracy. And then let's copy the stuff we like in small chunks rather than saying, here's a big process for doing it, And the same looking at anti-patterns or things which might be dysfunctional patterns in a team as things that we might want to stop doing. So that's going to be the approach for what we do about what we've got as a focus. And the final section is really for individual teams to look at the material we've covered and to say, what is it that we want to action in between this and the next meeting? So what's the area that I want to take away as a team? So it's very focused on practical outcomes. So that's the rough overview. Questions or comments? Okay, is there a video, is the computer screen visible in the room? Cool. Okay, so do you want me to jump into the sort of health check process, Susan? I'm not hearing anything, so I guess I'm going to jump into it and just shoot in the dark. All right, rock and roll.
That's because one of you. Josh, that's a yes. Joshua.
Thanks. All right, I usually do this with a whiteboard. Since we don't have that, I'll just share my screen and we'll go with a real-time board. This is probably my favorite tool for doing, I guess, whiteboard similar things online. And we can do that for thinking together. So the key document that I use on this thing is this idea of a team health check. And the idea is that you have a section like those coherent sections, and you basically say, what does a 1 look like, which is like extreme dysfunction? This is not working at all in our team. What does a 5 look like, which is pure awesome? And then you have a 2 for poor, a 3 for okay, and a 4 for pretty good. And you can sort of define that as you like. I've knocked out some of the definitions of what I think here, but I think the most important thing about this is a team actually talking about these areas and setting them together. Because what I think is highly functional might not be what your team thinks is highly functional. And this is a case of, here's a scaffold which you can look at and use and change as you want, but it's also a suggestion of the process I'm going to run through is, let's explore one of these as a topic together as a way for how you come up with the 1 to 5s. Because it's the discussions around that which are quite useful for a team in its own right. One of the things that I do in this spreadsheet is, here are the different areas, and you can start to rate teams with a 1 to 5 and do these sort of spider graphs around it, which some people like to look at and see. And if you're looking at how to do this kind of thing with multiple teams at once, often you can just stack up the columns and get a sense of the whole, a larger group, by analyzing the perceived health of the smaller teams. So that's one thinking tool that I find useful in this. And so if we go into one of them, usually say the rhythms, for example, is, how well is the team maintaining regular rhythms and rituals? No rhythms at all. So 1, there's nothing going on there. For poor attendance, unclear. Rhythms are sporadic or ad hoc. Okay. Unconscious but good. Conscious and consciously and consistently improving. So that was what I've worked with some people, and they like that definition. And I've got a bunch of them here as well, and here's a bunch of sort of empty ones. So the process that I want to invite us to at the moment is, if we look at that coherence canvas, what is, I don't have that on my screen, sorry, but what is an area or a topic of health that you'd like to use to workshop together? Like, what's on top for people in their teams?
I think for academy feedback is one, just because we don't have a process right now. So.
Cool. Can you tell me more about what you mean by feedback? Is that individual performance feedback, or is that feedback loops in the team or the org? Or?
I'm thinking specifically of individual feedback. We're actually all right at getting feedback about delivery and courses like content we deliver. But yeah, individual feedback is what I'm referring to specifically.
Cool. What about others? I can't hear the room. The room's still muted.
How about now? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, I'm on Academy, and I really like the one on rhythm. I think it encompasses a lot of the patterns Academy is missing. I've tried to implement the rhythm using Jira to different levels of success. Each individual seems to like Jira to a different degree, even though I like it a lot. But yeah.
What about you, Donnie, or anybody from the OD team? Josh, we sent you the link to the coherence canvas if you want to put it up on the screen. We'll do it. Okay, what about Claudia and Sarah? Are there any of these areas that's jumping out at you to start thinking about? Roles. Yeah. So that was a roles, Josh.
Okay,
yeah.
So we've got complete divergence so far.
Yeah, roles and decisions. Claudia? Conflict resolution and agreements. Conflict resolution. Did you catch that, Josh?
Yep, conflict and agreements.
So what's the question? What's the question?
So if we're going to spend, say, a bit of time exploring what a 1 to 5 looks like for a particular area, what area would be the most useful for you to go through right now?
We're back to the online team. Who's missing from remote callers on your area?
So is it from that list you had?
Yes.
Yep, but it can be anything you want as well.
Okay, we're going to share the screen again so you can see and make your own topic. Can you stop sharing for a second, Jamie, please? So fun. So well fun. Great, here we go. Here's the coherence canvas with all of the different areas that we're picking how to spend our time from. So who have we not heard from online? Go ahead. Micah, what jumps out at you from this list as a starting point? Micah or Josh? No, sorry, Donnie.
And sorry, is it things that we think are issues on our team, or just in general?
So I would say that what would be most useful for you to go through when you think about your team? It doesn't have to be an issue, but what's the area you're most interested in personally?
We don't have this problem, but I think a lot of the issues in other teams are either experience-based, lack of experience-based, or ego-based. So I don't know where that would fall.
I didn't catch that. Sorry. With
I feel like issues I've seen on teams come down to lack of experience or ego issues. So I don't know where taming the ego would fall on this.
One thing I find is useful about this sort of framework of a health check is it doesn't really matter if it's in a category or not. Like if you wanted to say how are we all doing with ego management as a team, and you could start to say what does bad look like and what does good look like, you can still have that conversation as a group. And I've never seen a team do one around ego. I've often seen that attacked or dealt with implicitly rather than explicitly. But I think that that's the sort of idea. So it sounds like we've got pretty clear divergence on the things, and given the sort of pace of the technology at the moment, maybe I'll just pick one to dive into as an exercise, and we can start to explore what a 1 to 5 look like as a group, and then we can go through a couple more if there's interest. Does that sound good for folks? All right.
You could share your screen on those things.
So one of the key ideas of this is that it can be done as one of the key exercises of the foundation course to help the cohort think together. But this is also a really good process which works for your team. Say, okay, let's talk about roles, and let's start to talk about what good looks like or what bad looks like for how you've seen roles work well in other teams. So if we just go through this exercise now, and I can be the scribe for folks on the whiteboard. So if you just want to say, what is a characteristic of a 1 or a 3 or a 5? So just say the number you're talking to and what's a characteristic of it, and I'll start to scatter some post-it notes up around the numbers. And for the topic, let's go with roles. So if you think about when you've seen roles work well in teams and when you've seen roles work badly, what's happened?
I don't know what he asked. So can you hear us? So Josh, perhaps it would be best for us to split here, and you guys talk about it up there, and we'll talk about it in person here. So it's going to matter.
Oh, great, you got one.
Okay.
Okay, let's segregate the communities, or segment rather. We have 4 of us online.
Yeah, so I guess to start, just when roles don't work, so I guess our number 1 would be when there's no clearly defined role for anyone. So people don't know exactly what they should be doing, and then other people on the team don't know what their team members are doing. So that's the key recipe for dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I've definitely seen that. What feels a little bit better than that, but still not quite good?
This is Micah. So I would even, I'm not sure if this would be at a 2 or a 1, but I think there's dysfunction that can happen in the opposite direction of over prescriptive roles. So, if people are too tightly boxed into roles, then people aren't, naturally gravitating toward what they are interested in or good at. People get kind of typecast into doing certain things to learn new skills and take risks on things that they don't know a ton about. So yeah, I could see it going that way as well if it's too tightly defined.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because I was thinking about what a 5 would look like, and I'm like, okay, you can't just say you have a very clear description of what your role is, because that's not what a 5 would look like. You need room for that ambiguity and exploration and like personal autonomy in your role.
Yeah, love it. And one thing I like to do in this exercise is starting to do like a so what. So here you started to see Micah talking about over-prescriptive roles lead to disengagement or people not learning. And so that's a useful sort of thinking exercise when you're running with it. So I heard room for ambiguity. I also heard autonomy would be sort of characteristics of a 5. What other things come up when you look at this?
Yeah, I would say characteristics of a 4 or 5 would be that the roles are highly context specific. So instead of thinking about roles as something that is, kind of immutable, it's like the role I'm playing in this meeting is as a facilitator, or the role I'm playing in this project is as project owner. Yeah.
Cool. Another thing I think I've seen in sort of healthy roles is around they're not static, they're dynamic, and they're adapting. So a team that has a process for saying, actually, this role isn't working, and let's fix it quickly and let's fix it often, but they don't spend all their time in sort of strategic meetings about who does what, is a sort of a good feature.
What about competencies?
Mm-hmm. Tell me what.
Do you have the skills and experience to actually do the job you're doing or not? Do you have the skills and experience to mentor junior members of the team to become better? Do you have the skills and experience to know when to ask for help?
Cool. Some of this, so for example, when I hear you talk about skills to ask for help, that kind of, it starts to feel like it's bleeding into sort of another area around individual capacity and sort of personal development. And this might be less about roles. And so another thing I find in this is that it's, it's an artificial box to talk about one particular area of health, and things start to bleed in different directions. But sort of using that and saying, I might start to move this one up further away from the roles part and start to say that might lead into another area. And when I hear you talk about do individual skills match the role needs, that kind of feels like probably a core level. Like it's if you're not doing that for a role, then you've got a big problem. And so it's like a baseline for a role to be good. So I'd start to put that about a 3 or so, personally. Does that feel good?
Yeah.
Cool.
I want to comment on the dynamic adapting, because I agree that it's more like high functioning when you adapt and your role changes, but to what extent do we need to define the role as it changes? So like my role on my team is changing. How much do we need to so as new people come on the team, I'm trying to explain what I do, but I'm like, okay, I was hired for this, but I don't really do any of those things anymore. And I don't know what the agreement with the rest of my team is in terms of what my role is. Do you know what I mean? Like just
absolutely.
Job description.
One of the things I think here is that a good role has got this balance between clarity and ambiguity. It's a little bit like how legislators, when they write laws, if they're too specific, they're fragile and they break. And if they're not specific enough, then they don't provide any guidance. So I think that a good role should do the same. And to me, that's sort of like how much level of detail do you go into is one way of doing that. The other thing I heard from there, which I sort of assumed or projected onto what you're saying, was that a bad thing is like if roles change every week and no one knows what they're doing, it's as bad as not having any roles. Right. So there needs to be enough longevity in a role for it to be useful.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other things that you want to name about roles that sort of feel useful for this spectrum? Cool. So now, just given this sort of what we've said so far, if you had to pick a number for where your team was at, where would you land yourselves at the moment?
I think Academy might be around 4, 3.5 or 4.
Cool.
I think this is something that's been good with Academy lately, as we are changing leadership and people are stepping up and taking on new roles. I think one thing that's unclear that like brings us down a little bit is just not making it clearly defined. Maybe things changed and we are like comfortable with what we're all doing now, but it's not explicit enough.
Cool. Any other thoughts from the other teams?
I mean, I think we're always between a 4 and a 5. I mean, we're always talking about how roles change as we get bigger and build. Yeah.
Cool.
I guess, Josh, part of me just struggles, and maybe it's like I just need to have more empathy for other people, but I just find this stuff so obvious, to the point where it's like I feel like issues at consensus just come around experience level, ego management. You have some very junior teams, and maybe it's because of egos, but they don't say, you know what, let's get someone better than us to help build this team faster and stronger. And it's really friggin' strange that doesn't happen more. Because I think in a healthy organism, if you're struggling, you put your ego aside. You can still be called founder or whatever, but, you want to be better overall, so you put your ego down and you find that person who's, I think we don't value, for some reason, some teams don't value experience or think they have all the answers, or they invested in crypto early, and that's fundamental attribution error, that they're therefore geniuses when, they're probably 80% luck, as opposed to like they got ETH rich because they're geniuses sort of problem. It's one of the things I think, perhaps. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling. But I'm just trying to get empathy for myself, and maybe because I don't want to come off like a grouch, I just hopefully you have some empathy for me. It's kind of why I'm struggling with some of the stuff.
Yeah, and I think I definitely understand that, and I think that what I've seen in consensus is a very divergent level of problems and of experience levels and challenges. So I guess the invitation now is to really focus on where's your learning edge at. What's the bit that you want to go deeper into? And that if you're finding these conversations like, actually, this isn't the conversation you want to have, knowing what the conversation you do want to have is really useful. And I think the other one is about encouraging people to share their experiences with each other, so that the stuff that you're finding might be something that someone else is finding. And that it's the case of learning where each other's learning edge is at, so you can sort of help the people that you bump into, and the people you bump into can help you, and so on, is how I'd think about it.
Yeah, and one thing to just add to that is that I think worth sort of distinguishing between kind of assessing people's varying expertise level along different skill sets, and just figuring out like what job each person is doing. And I think on some teams that delineation of like design and engineering, for instance, is really easy to do because somebody is trained as an engineer and somebody is trained as a designer. So on a development team, it's actually very easy to delineate those things. Whereas on a team like, or dev, for instance, we have a lot of people who have like a variety of skills, and it's actually not very clear what job should be done by who. So I think that's a somewhat different but related issue to the issue of experience level and kind of checking one's ego at the door and that kind of thing. So yeah, maybe just worth expressing that as well.
Can we start?
Cool. I think it's a great point, and I just made a rough note there to sort of placeholder it. But yeah, I do have noticed that when you're dealing with a formal profession, development, design, building, it's much more delineated, and when something is more emergent, you don't have that body of context.
It looks like Susan wants to convert. You say?
Hi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So Sarah is she's just taken a photo of what we've got here, and I'm just wondering what is the best way to amalgamate our work. Perhaps I could read, or Sarah could read our 1s through to our 5s to see, or Josh, would you have a better process? Who's sharing it? Sorry, who's sharing their screen? Oh, Josh is.
Yep. So, no, happy for you to talk through what you learned. And also, it's not for me, not just about what you put in the different numbers, but what did you observe about the process?
Yeah, maybe Kate, you want to, what did you observe about the process of what we just did while you come in?
What did I observe in the process that we just did? Oh, wow, that's really close. Let's see. I don't know. I think we're all saying the same thing. I'm just like, in full disclosure, I'm feeling chaotic. So I'm sort of observing right now. This is a sensitive topic, I think, for me, because it's been very unclear. It's probably been unclear my whole time here in instances, not just on OD. So I'm just feeling I'm just observing right now. Yeah, sorry, I don't have anything else to say. But we have a lot of good ideas. You know, Josh was about to say, Mary and Susan and Josh were driving, which was really cool to see.
Yeah, so just what I noticed was that it was easy for us to, I noticed that we got into the negative, like the number 1s first, so lack of roles, just not knowing the difference in skills and experience, you know, misaligned expectations, chaos, overload, no rules. I thought Claudia had a really interesting word, which was claustrophobic. And then, of course, the 5s, you know, clear, exhaustive, our capacity understood, roles that are not owned in perpetuity, making sure that our work styles match our roles, making sure that we're able to self-select. Then the 2 kind of other streams that we got into was, I think it's kind of the same. So how do we encourage ourselves and each other not to just choose roles that are easy for us, but roles that are a little bit of a stretch? And how do we know the difference and mitigate against either the team encouraging somebody to take on something that is it's just too much of a stretch, or an individual in the team putting their hand up to do something that they clearly don't have the capacity or the ability to do. So that feels like the 2 area for me. Like, yeah, either offering too much, too little, the team in a well-intentioned way encouraging people to take on stuff that they can't manage. And then the second thing, which was, like, I think Sarah had really clearly around the pattern in this company generally is overload, spread too thin, a mile wide and an inch deep, having to switch context all the time. So that seemed like the other sort of middle kind of noticing intentions. Anything else?
Yeah, so I guess what I would like to add is, I guess comparing this to like a traditional corporation, you usually have someone with much more experience over you as like a mentor or buddy, and he takes care of speccing out what the job is even before you even start. It's extremely clear what you're supposed to deliver, what the content is, what the copy is, what the images are, whatever your job is. It depends, but like what is the scope of your job and what are the specs before you even start. And here I feel like it's way more ad hoc, and that's why I tell people that this should not be their first job, because you have to kind of be your own manager and know and have experience in having someone that's really good at that to learn from before, I guess, and from both sides. So like the guy who's giving it to you doesn't know what he's giving you, and you don't even know what you're receiving. So of course you're not going to deliver the right thing. And that adds on to all the other things, like you don't know your role, you don't know your experience level, you don't have the resources to ask for help in places where you're not you don't have experience in, maybe you have zero experience in, you know, and then not wanting to drop the ball on that and feel that you failed the task because of something that wasn't your fault, really.
Sarah?
I was just going to add something you said that I didn't think you captured here, which was you don't know where to go for help. Do you mind if I draw that, please?
Oh, nice. That's really clear.
Cool. I think that's our summary done, Josh. We haven't grouped it in such a clear way, but maybe you can probably do that onto the real-time board if you wanted, from what we've given you.
Oh, he's got the photo next to it.
Yeah,
Oh, it's nice.
Yeah, it is very cool. Oh. So over to you.
Yeah. Telegram. Yay, save day.
Okay. Back to you, Josh.
You're on mute, Joshua.
You're on mute, JB.
Cool, how's that? Good. So I'll go through a brief summary of what we sort of put up, and then we will go into some noticings from our side. Things like no clearly defined roles at all was a 1. Over prescriptive roles was also a 1, so not leaving enough room. And then we had things like room for ambiguity, more around the 5s. Dynamic roles that are adapting. There was one which was around individual skills matching the role needs and making sure that the competencies and the needs of the role balance. This started to blend into an interesting line around, actually, what about the other skills people need around like asking for help or accepting feedback, and like going into the sort of managing your individual ego line of thinking. And there was another one which was around context-specific roles. So I'm stepping into a role of facilitator for this meeting rather than I'm the facilitator of the team all the time. So it's a temporary role which someone can put on. Roles which are now for enough autonomy. There was a line of thinking over here when we started going to over-prescriptive roles about what the consequences of that were, around people being disengaged or people not learning more. And there was also a reflection around some roles like developer or designer are very well understood, and there's a lot of shared assumptions about what they are, and there's a lot of shared context about how you're good at it or not. But other roles are less clearly defined around, well, what is an org designer really? That kind of approach, and how do you talk about people's skills and abilities in the less defined spaces as well as the highly defined ones. That's some of the content we sort of came up with. Any reflections from the folk about the experience? All right.
So I have a question, which is, so I assume that the goal of this exercise is to kind of bring us through an example of this foundation's work that we'll be doing with the teams throughout Consensus, kind of offering as a service. And a question I have is the approach to basically just allow teams to kind of like figure out their 1 to 5s on their own, or is the approach to also give some ideas or examples of 1 to 5s on these things, because it's possible that maybe a team is pretty new and they haven't run into some of the problems, or have never maybe been in a team where they've experienced a 5 or something. So I guess the question is around that. Is this meant to be completely sort of DIY, or is part of this process going to be kind of coming up with examples, I guess?
What I would say is it's both. So the way I run this process is, the first thing is, let's briefly overview the sort of sections. Then let's dive into a longer exploration like this, which is, let's give it some numbers, let's talk about it, let's generate from scratch our perspective of what 1 to 5 looks like. Then I would jump over to one that you've created already around, okay, here is one take of what our 1 to 5 looks like. Do you as a team want to adapt this in any way? Do you want to have it reflect some of the thinking you've done and change it and make it a bit your own? Because it's as much about, because I think this is the thing I heard in one of the check-ins in the beginning, was it's easy to give people ideas, but for them to actually turn them into tangible results, they need to make them their own. And you really want to help people build their capacity for thinking about their team and making interventions to make their team better, instead of just going, here's how you should make your team better, in my opinion. So that's sort of it's designed as a 2-phase approach. First is generative, then it's here's some thinking which we've done already, and let's adapt that thinking to where you want to go.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. So the next phase of this that I would suggest doing with the team is you can do a planning poker game, which is around, okay, everyone, on the count of 3, put your hands out and say, are you a 5 or you're a 3 or 4, 2, 1, like choose the number. If you've got a big group of people, you can get outliers to speak first to surface difference of opinions. And the value is in the conversation. The value is not in the number at the end of it. And it's really just about getting a sense of where are we at on this sort of topic. One of the noticings I had from our session was that roles was probably a bit too far away from people's learning edges. Like when we started to talk about numbers, it was like, yep, 4s, 5s, feel like we're pretty good on this. It's not a huge priority for us to get better. And when you think about all these different health checks lining up, it's really about going towards the team saying, okay, you've got limited amount of bandwidth for improving your team processes. What's the one thing you want to tackle next? And the idea is, what's the one area where you might want to move from a 2 to a 3 or a 4 to a 5, or what's the one area you want to focus on for a particular time? And that's kind of the end goal of this health check process, is around helping people identify, this is the area we want to focus on right now.
I just wanted to add that one of the things that for me is the next step from this particular process is starting to think about and harvesting patterns and anti-patterns. So I think the first part of it is understanding what really shitty looks like and what really great looks like, and what are we seeing. What are we seeing, or what are we potentially seeing in each of these numbers? So we've got the definition of what really good or really poor looks like. But if we can start to harvest the patterns and anti-patterns of what we're seeing, can start to be the basis of our experiments or our interventions to move the dial from a 2 to a 3 or a 3 to a 4. I feel like that is going to be the richness of the process. So, Joshua, maybe do you want to talk a little bit more about that, and maybe also be good to share with Will what we've got to up until now and catch him up now that he's back? Share your screen again, maybe, Jamie?
Right. Cool. So a brief summary, we started to talk about some areas of health checks to go on. The team was very divergent, like pretty much everyone named something that hadn't been named before. And so I get the sense that there's a lot of different needs in this group at the moment. And then we went through an exercise of saying, in our experience, what does really bad look like in terms of practices, and what does really good look like? And started to sort of get a sense of shared understanding about that. And then in our group, we asked people to initially say, where do you feel like your team's at between 1 to 5? With the intent being to get a quick rubric across lots of different areas. And I find the first time you do it, it takes a bit of time, and we spent a fair bit of time on this. And then as you do it more with the team, you can start to get them out pretty quickly.
Great.
That's where we got to.
So Joshua, I think my request or recommendation would be, should we try to do another one and then come back together and see what we noticed that time? If it's easier, harder, made more or less sense, and then maybe for our last 45 minutes, we could get into some of the pattern harvesting. How does
that works for me.
Okay. Can you take us through a process to decide which one we want to do next?
I'd suggest we let each group decide which one they want to do. That way we'll get the highest bang for buck for people's time.
Great.
So if online folks do one, and then room does the one you want.
Great. See you in 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes.
All right. So what's useful for folks online to go through? I remember Josh had feedback.
I like feedback.
Go with that. Feedback? All right, hurrah. All right, so if you think about feedback, what have you seen work or not?
I think it works when I mean, at least for us, when we give each other feedback, we know it's coming from a good place. There's no I don't know. I feel like some people might assume people are out to get them when they give feedback. But if you create a very psychologically safe environment where you know people are giving you feedback because they want you to be better, I don't know, it just comes out differently, or the way your brain interprets it is different.
I think it's important for the team to meet and talk about feedback before it goes into a whole process of doing feedback, in order to create those kind of the sense that what Josh is talking about. So it's an understanding, what's its role, what's its purpose, what are the right times to give it, what are the formats to give it, how do people want to receive it, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's important too, just from the perspective of if you just start giving feedback to people without a schedule or something, then it can feel like you're just providing feedback when they're doing a poor job or something. Perhaps, I don't know, on Academy, like I was saying earlier, just individual feedback is non-existent, at least from a personal perspective. So I guess that would be a 1, just not having feedback.
Yep. One thing I often find is a good culture is asking consent before giving feedback. And often I find that helps to, for people to get in the right frame of mind, because it takes energy to process feedback, and if you're really busy and you're not ready to think about it, sometimes it's not that useful. And it also makes it clear that feedback is for the benefit of the person receiving it, not for the venting of the person giving it. What would a culture of okay feedback look like but not great? Sorry, cut you off. Go ahead.
So, so something I've seen works very well in feedback that's both feedback on the work and also feedback on the relationship is that it is sort of framed as a conversation that starts in curiosity rather than judgment. So if I'm experiencing some kind of tension because of somebody that I'm working with, or I just feel like something is wrong with the work product, approaching it from a place of curiosity and asking questions as to maybe why a ball was dropped or why it was done a certain way, rather than I think you're doing this wrong, or I think you're mean, or whatever, or I think you're lazy, or XYZ.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I definitely like that. I've noticed that these 3 ones here are less about what is the quality of the feedback our team is doing, and it's more about these are patterns which are useful to help people give good feedback. So they sort of start to feel less about the health check and more about what are patterns that are useful. So I sort of just grouped them off to the side there. What would a culture of okay feedback look like? So it's good, but it's not great.
That I think that it happens only kind of as needed. So rather than kind of on a regular basis, like a regular cadence. Because I think it's a process of people just getting used to receiving feedback and integrating it. And I think that if it's just done as needed without a regular structure of retros, it's still good that it's done. And I think that, but it's not as effective, I think, as people slowing down and recognizing that it becomes a ritual, so that it feels more like a team is kind of reorganizing and self-organizing and integrating and learning lessons.
Also, feedback that doesn't get anywhere. Like if you just say, "Good job, everyone. We did great work," or like, "Hey, like we screwed this up. Like let's do better next time." Instead of saying like, maybe say like how we're going to do better, or like what are we going to change, like action items, I guess.
Yep.
And along with that, I think I think that feedback can be done, and people can go like, "Yeah, that was really great feedback, thanks," and then nothing happens with it. But there's also like, there's not a sense of people seeing feedback being heard and integrated. So it's, I think it's when it's really high functioning, it's a team who takes a step back on a regular basis and goes, "How are we doing overall with this? Like, are we improving, or are we just kind of giving feedback and hoping it gets better?" Like Josh said.
Because what I heard there was the idea of like, if the feedback is inactionable, that's probably worse than if the feedback's good but no one does anything about it. Because at least you're giving good feedback in that one, but you've got a culture of not acting upon it.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure how to make this not quite sure how to phrase this, but there's something about the frustration of, feedback is given over time, but improvement doesn't. There isn't like a sense of traction or measurable advancement, especially over time. Like, okay, we're giving feedback, but I'm not necessarily sure that we're getting better at what we're doing.
Yeah.
Or maybe we're making huge improvement, but we're not even pointing towards that. It's just there's something where it's not over time captured, so that the team can increase its understanding of how it's learning. Shifting from feedback into, being a deliberative organization, a developmental organization.
Mm-hmm. So I heard 2 different ideas there. One is that there's no momentum of improvement in terms of the team's capacity. But I also heard the other one about the team's not getting better at giving feedback, like it's not deepening its practice as well as getting the tangible improvement.
Yes.
Meta question about this process. Some brainstorming exercises are, explicitly framed as a yes and, where you don't, challenge somebody else's thing, and you sort of add to add to the process and keep ideas flowing, and then others are, explicitly you're trying to actually like throw ideas into conflict, so that you can tease out the truth from the different perspectives. And I'm just wondering, like, which approach do you typically take here, and if you leave that up to the teams, how do they like sort of figure out their approach prior to this process?
I would generally say this. I see this part of the process as divergent, like it's additive, it's yes, and you want to start to get the ideas sort of accumulating, and that when you're trying to get to the convergent phase is when you're trying to say, okay, what are we going to do about it? If you're doing like the planning poker version of like, and someone says I think we're a 5, and someone says I think we're a 2, that's where you might get the sort of crunchy difference of opinions part of it to hold that a bit more. Though I find often there's more agreement than not. In terms of where teams are at, like, yeah, feedback sucks, let's get better at it, kind of thing. And it's really like, okay, how are we going to do it, and what are we going to do? And having this idea here where, okay, people started to notice some patterns about this is stuff we've seen, which is great, which you could start to put into the, hey, here are some things we might want to consider doing. And the next phase around like, and this is why I like the pattern, anti-pattern process so much. Like, I've written a blog post about speedbacking, which is a specific hour-long workshop that I run based off our work at the students with the academy, our academy, not yours, Dev Academy, and that is it's really good for kickstarting a culture of feedback, which we run for a lot of organizations. So that's like one particular thing. If people want to get better at feedback, I can point to that blog post and say, here's something you might want to look at and try yourselves. So that language of sharing patterns amongst peers, I find, is where people can pull in the actions that they want to take.
Gotcha. Yeah, just to add to that, part of why I asked is there was kind of a lingering curiosity for me when I suggested the culture of curiosity, if people disagree with that, because I've definitely been in environments where very direct sort of judgmental feedback is the culture, and I would be very curious to know, not necessarily in this circle right now, but like within my team, are there people on the team that would think that what I'm saying is a 5 is actually a 1, and vice versa? And so, just kind of curious how that gets sussed out, if it's just the kind of
if you want process to lean into sussing that out, then you could ask the team to say, okay, let's try and write down a sentence we all agree on about what a 5 is and what a 1 is. And so if you try to put in the start from curiosity as a 5, and someone wanted to push back on that, that's kind of the thinking tool, which might structure that a bit more.
I see. So that happens after this process? Is it you sort of diverge back into those one sentence?
I kind of play around and chop and change, and it's really like, what are people going to find useful? And it came like some people really like the structured, let's get the language down. Other people feel like that's a complete waste of time, and they want to get straight to the sort of pattern sharing idea. So, and again, that's my style is very fluid about following the need and the requests in the room, rather than saying, okay, here's the process, and you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And I find it's always changing.
Cool. Great. Thank you for that, and thanks for the patience and going up a level. So.
No worries. Any other things that people want to name about feedback itself? We can start going into individual patterns or interventions if we want. I think we've still got some time. Or we can keep diving into what you think good looks like or what you think bad looks like.
Last thing that I would name is that I think receiving feedback is as much of a skill as giving feedback. And then also, go ahead. Yeah.
I think this is what I love what Donnie was saying before about ego. Like, it's, if you've got people who've got like their personality under control, then it's so much easier to work with them. But if you've got people with really sensitive points, and it's like, what do you mean that I didn't do it? Like, and that flares people up when you're just trying to help them get better, then it's often a similar sort of cause about not having a deep sense of self-worth. So I think helping people feel confident and happy and strong in themselves as people is really, it's like you can never get to 5 without that, in my opinion.
And also that, there's a process of like a team making even agreements, like, okay, somebody gives feedback to somebody, to me, Like, and if I be like, whoa, that was kind of hard, then, you know, there's a standing agreement that I can go to somebody else and say, I just got this feedback. Can you help me with it? And it's not considered a big deal. It's considered all part of improvement, right? Both kind of like how do I actually integrate it? And then also like, do I believe it? Do I agree with it? Do I want to push back later? But the sense that it doesn't have to just be in the moment, we're all on point. I got the feedback, I integrated it, but that we can call in each other for support.
Yep, and I think I've got sort of like an hour-long feedback workshop that I run for people, and one of the ideas around learning the skill of receiving feedback and learning the skill of giving feedback and creating safe playgrounds for people to practice giving and receiving feedback when it's easy, and to talk about different levels of feedback. So the idea of like, here's something I think you did really well, that's kind of playing at easy level. And if I'm saying about, here's something you did poorly, and it really hurt me or upset me or caused me pain, you're kind of playing at the much harder level, and you want to be on the top of your game to give that kind of feedback well. Any other noticings or reflections here?
I guess on a similar note to what Will just offered is sort of the same thing, but on the like upstream, before the feedback happens, talking with others about it is sometimes useful, and it's an important skill to learn how to do that without it feeling gossipy or you know, like you're venting to somebody. But sometimes it is genuinely useful to kind of check in with somebody else on the team about something you're experiencing with someone else, in a space that, you know, that doesn't kind of create a culture of gossip and that kind of thing. So, and maybe actually, you know, in a way, it kind of helps you to prepare for providing that feedback.
Yeah, okay.
One of the practices that I've been on teams that we have is that it's fine. Like, you know, Micah, if you come to me and say like, I need to, like, first you would say like, I just need to vent or whatever else. And that's great. And let me check in and see if this sounds reasonable. But then the practice is that my role is to really listen, but always to kind of bring the conversation around to, so what are your actionable steps? What do you need to say to that person? What, you know, to turn into help kind of coaching, so that it's, you know, so that it's not, I think that's what prevents it from being gossip, if then the conversation as a practice of turning towards, so what do we do with this?
Yeah, and it's like, I see the patterns popping up, like the idea of, you know, often when you're hurt, it's really good to vent to a safe space and to share all your feelings and know that it's not going to travel further and that you're not going to hurt anyone by sort of sharing those feelings. And I think the idea, another one that I find really useful is practice giving difficult feedback to someone else who's sort of somewhat aware of the situation first. I want to give Bob some feedback. I'm thinking about structuring it this way. What do you think? Am I, you know, do you see the same thing? Is it going to be useful? Will Bob take it the right way? Because giving difficult feedback is a real art, and crafting something so that someone can receive the information but not feel judged or hurt or retract from it and avoid acting upon it is definitely a skill.
Yeah, but one other thing I'll just say is I feel like feedback itself is a downstream thing. It's a reactive thing, and actually developing relationships whereby you end up gaining a better understanding of why people are acting the way they're acting, by being, again, it's sort of around this theme of curiosity, but not just curiosity about why a specific thing happened, but curiosity about the person and the members of your team and sort of what makes them tick. I've found can actually obviate a lot of the kind of feedback, like difficult feedback sessions, because you know, it kind of becomes obvious what's going on once you really get to know people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Micah. And I would add to it, like, you know, for people to be able to have good conversations about when they're setting up stuff, like what are the expectations? So much feedback is actually people not meeting expectations, but so many expectations are unspoken expectations. And it's, you know, and expectation isn't a great word because that sounds a little bit hierarchical, but it's this kind of sense that, you know, what are we agreeing to doing? And do we really understand that? And have we stayed in this conversation until we've churned up everything that could get in our way?
And I think assumption might be another word to play with there as well. But the idea of when people have got different assumptions and they're not explicit, then it's definitely a recipe for a challenge.
A phrase I love from a friend who does OD is an expectation is just a resentment waiting to happen.
Cool. And I think to me that touches on, I guess, one of the most underlying themes I've seen in all of this work is the balance between implicit and explicit, or like unconscious and conscious in teams. Like, what do you want to write down and formalize and crystallize with language? And what do you want to leave just unconsciously held in the culture? And the balance between the two, because I think you can swing too far in either direction. And the idea of like, what can you safely leave in terms of implicit assumptions about, well, that's just how we talk with each other, and compared to, okay, it's written down that this is our communication protocol in a way. Any other noticings or threads that people want to tug on? I'm curious about, Josh, you brought up the feedback topic. Like, what would you find most useful if you said, okay, I want to try and make some changes in my team? What sort of tools or thinking or support would be most useful for you to have a crack at that?
Probably figuring out how to make it a regular ritual to start. Because I guess since we're at the stage of not having much to none, just making it a ritual, even if the feedback isn't high quality to start, just making it a ritual and then working on improving the quality of the feedback later on. I think I don't have much experience like creating feedback mechanisms in a team, so that's just how I'm thinking about it now. Do you guys think that is the right way to go about it? Because this is new territory for me. So.
Yeah, I definitely would start. I think having a regular space creates a practice zone, and it also makes sure that feedback happens, because it's really easy to say feedback is important, everyone do more feedback, and then nothing happened. So I think I like your instinct there. I would probably kick it off with some simple guidelines, and I'm really happy to sort of either share some materials for you or run you through some of the key points I do in my sort of feedback workshops. But having some key points for people just around like actionable, specific kind feedback and talking about easy feedback and hard feedback is often enough of a few pointers just to get people going in the right direction.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, something I've also found is while I think prompts and some structure are really helpful, especially for folks who haven't done a lot of this kind of peer feedback work in the past. I've also found that there's sort of a balance between it being overly structured and too free form, especially around the question of like, do you respond or talk? Is it a conversation or is it a one-way thing? And I've found in some environments the kind of the prompt or the request is that that it's one way, that the person does not respond, because it's trying to prevent people becoming argumentative and doing the like wait but like that didn't happen or whatever. I think that guideline is typically there to prevent defensiveness and promote people really absorbing the feedback, but then at the same time it can feel really it can feel like somebody just sort of like unloading on you rather than it actually being a conversation, again, that's like, based in curiosity. And I personally like in my like feedback sessions to have a conversation about like what was going on there. But it requires like a high level of emotional maturity and like awareness around not being defensive and that kind of thing. So not really sure how to sum that up, but I feel like it can go too far in either direction of structure versus lack of structure.
I think one way to get to that is to kind of do a conversation similar to this, with a team initially and just kind of even just create people's thoughts of like, you know, what's good about feedback, what's hard about feedback, how do we want to, like, even I think for a lot of folks or teams, it's kind of surprising to even think about, oh, there's different ways we could do it. Like, you know, Micah, what you just said about like, do we respond? Do we not respond? Those are great questions to ask at the beginning, and to even like, you know, because then a team can be a little thoughtful around, oh, we're experimenting. You know, like let's do 4 retros and let's do 2 of them where we don't respond and 2 where we do, and let's talk about the process a little bit. And I think people can get a little bit, especially folks who are very kind of linear in their thinking and orientation, can get a little aggravated by the meta conversation. But if you get a good feedback conversation out of it, I think that people come around.
Yeah, I really like that. And that's one of the reasons why I structured this process here as a conversation where we start to talk about the topic, is that it's creating that unconscious field for people to fill into. And I think if you can sort of have that and then have some rituals and then encourage experimentation and adapting, the teams develop the muscle to sort of fix their own processes or fix their own structures rather than relying on someone else to tell them how it's done.
One last piece is that my finding of kind of like creating the rituals is that it can often lead to a little bit of shallow feedback at the beginning. People stay pretty safe. And so it takes some modeling. And what's good is that, if, you know, for people to even like, I've done it where I've been like, I'll go up to somebody who I've, you know, who we have a pretty solid relationship and be like, let's model giving like really like actually feedback to each other in front of the group so that people can see that this goes somewhere. And depending on the level of trust you've got with somebody, we even do it like, we don't stage it, we do it for real. But that helps break that ice and be like, oh, whoa, okay, this is useful. I can see where this got to people. And I think this, for me, I prefer the more conversational style rather than the one-way, no response. I'm with Mike on that, but it takes some time to break the ice and get people to get real.
Yeah, +1. I found the same. Whenever I structure a feedback session, it'll be very surface, but often it can sort of raise the topic and give people a practice space to do it. Cool. Everyone happy with this topic and ready to move on? I'm not sure where we're at with time and Susan and the people in the room. Okay, yes. What did you notice about this process overall around doing this a second time and diving into a different topic?
I mean, in a way, this is, I guess, somewhat similar to my question last time around. I'm really trying to be self-aware about the probably the difference in conversation between a group that, you know, has some experience with org design and, you know, bottom-up non-hierarchical groups, and you know, a group doing this that maybe has like very little to no experience with this, and just wonder, yeah, like I'm always trying to check myself for like, am I giving a bad read by doing the exercise myself because I'm coming at it from a different place? And so just wondering, wondering if like other groups might feel like they're kind of floundering to come up with stuff here, and also noticing that like Will and I have been doing most of the talking here, and probably we have like a, you know, quite a bit of experience in sort of non-hierarchical groups. So yeah, I guess that like I'm actually not sure what the experience level is of other folks on the call in terms of like doing peer feedback, for instance, and just curious, like do these prompts feel like hard to answer? Yeah, I not sure if I'm like communicating that well, but do you see what I'm saying? That just like not sure if like this board would be filled with sickies right now if like, you know, I didn't have a ton of experience with 5 groups or 1 groups.
Yeah, I find that most groups can speak to what does good look like, what does great look like, and somewhere in the middle, and so that you can sort of get it populated. I do find that the current situation we're in now, where I feel like there's some people who are sort of peers, who are they've got their own teams, and they're sort of going through this process to learn from each other while focusing on their team, is very different from when you deal with just people on the workshop who are just talking about their team, where you can often get a lot more practical and real on it. And then having the layer in here of a bunch of people looking at it from a process point of view and going a bit meta, I think it's like just a few mixed sort of experiences, which makes this a bit less coherent than often when I do it. And when you combine that with the digital folks and the online and the in-person folks, it's definitely a bit more bumpy than normal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have little experience giving feedback like we've been talking about, but I'm also thinking about like the feedback aspect, but then also the organizational development part where like, how am I going to bring this back to the team to incorporate it? So there's like two levels. There's actual giving of feedback, and then there's the bringing the processes to the team around giving feedback. But I guess in both regards, my experience level is, I don't have much.
Cool. The in-person team have just sent me their picture, so I think we're ready to jump back to the room. Cool.
Are we on mute?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. We're ready. If you need more time, just let us know.
We're good.
Okay, great. Let us know how to proceed.
Do you want to talk to yours first?
No. Yes, we will. And we had some good process notices this time, so we'll share back on that first. So just a noticing on our side of the Canvas hits on a lot of really good points, but they don't stand alone. Kind of, they're visualized on the slide as like standalone things, but we just got talking about the interconnectedness of those things and causal and cause and effect relationships between them. And we know that's quite obvious, but I think something to like think about as we formulate this team foundations process. Right. Okay. Something to like think about when we go through the team foundations process is like, how would we order these things and how would we change these things to have more of a building cadence from the first week to the 10th week? Okay, so we're going to talk you through our list from starting at 1, thinking about conflict resolution and moving through to the 5s.
Okay, so just a real quick summary, as fast as I can, would be that number 1 would be like straight up bullying. I like to use the word, you're not quite sure why they don't like me, because I've used the other stronger words before and people have punished me for it, so I'm not going to use like more strong forms of it, but let's leave it at bullying. And just not feeling like you're taken seriously and you're alone. Then there's 3, which is acknowledging that there's something wrong and trying to fix it, but no matter what you do, it doesn't seem to help. And even if you do improve what you seem to have had wrong, it doesn't seem to be doing much. And then number 5 is just being a human being, being sensitive, being trusting and loving. I think just the team being a family and trusting each other and having each other's backs and no individual blame. The team is to blame, the individual works is number 5.
Okay. And we saw the really being at an amazing level around conflict resolution process is when we acknowledge that conflict has conflict transformation, so that conflict can actually take us to a new level in how we relate to each other and also our personal self-development. So that would be an optimal level to get to. And over to you.
Just as I shared the screen, stopped sharing the screen so that we could see the speakers. Cool. So we picked feedback for our topic, and we started to have things like, no feedback. There was one idea of like feedback coming from a good place and trusting the people around you. There was also an idea of there's a skill of receiving feedback, so that if people have a strong self-confidence or self-understanding, they can receive harder feedback than if they don't. The idea of making it a regular ritual, so that people can keep practicing it together and deepen their practice. The idea of like no feedback was one, but then inactionable feedback, like, hey, great work, or do better next time, where it's quite hard to do anything with it, as opposed to feedback which is actually on the money, but people don't do anything about it, and you just great feedback but no action. And there were some consequences of that. One thing I noticed in our session is we actually started to go quite a lot into good patterns for giving feedback, and starting to explore, what sort of interventions might be useful. Another noticing was that feedback felt a little bit like a symptom. Like, you don't go and fix the feedback process, you go and fix the strong relationships in the team, or the maturity of the individuals, or the assumptions that people have about each other's work, or the expectations. And that if you can fix those things, you're kind of reducing the need for feedback, or you're making feedback a lot easier, as opposed to just learning how to do feedback better, was one other noticing from our conversation. Any other things that people want to add?
From our end, we did the poker process on each of the components of the board, and it was really good to see the divergence and the convergence between what people believe their team is at on each of the parts of the coherence campus. So we recommend doing that within all teams. But maybe you want to explain what that is, Josh.
The planning poker idea? Sure. So this comes from estimation in agile sprints, which the developers and tech folks might be familiar with. So often the idea of, if you're measuring the complexity of a task, you might give it some numbers and you get everyone to say how hard do you think it is to build. And if you do it like a fist to five, with like fist being 0 and 5 being lots, and if you get a bunch of fists and some 2s and a 5, then you've kind of got some divergence in the group. And then if you've got a large number of people and you don't want to spend the time getting everyone to speak on it, you ask the people who are most divergent to speak and say why they chose that. And that might surface some information that the team wasn't aware of, and you can get some more divergent thinking sort of shared in the group. Then if you can say, okay, everyone, let's estimate it again. Where do you think the team's at? And if you converge naturally and everyone goes, okay, I think I'm a 3, or you have some people go, oh, actually, I didn't think of that, I'm going up to a 4, then you can naturally get convergence quite quickly through people just doing a second round. And if you've still got divergence, then that indicates often you might need to have a deeper conversation about it. So it's a practice that I really like from Agile, and I found it really useful in terms of teams thinking about, okay, how strong are our relationships, or how good is our feedback, or how clear are our agreements or our roles. And that if you have people who say, actually, I think they're not clear at all, and that everyone else doesn't, then you've got very clear ideas of what's going on in the dynamic. Cool. So that's pretty much the team health check sort of process and idea. And the idea is that if you build this up and you start to actually get towards filling out, like I'm just sharing and not sharing screens continuously here, and if you start to get to the stage where you build out a list of things which people have discussed and they can start to give numbers to as a team, then you've got this idea of a spider graph here. And then this phase is really like, okay, we sort of have a picture of where we're at. And the next one is, okay, if we can just move one area, which area is going to give us the most value? And it might be moving a 2 to a 3, or it might be trying to move a 4 to a 5. And so it's a kind of a prioritization approach. And then once you choose that one area, then it's really about like a research thing about, okay, what are some patterns, what are some anti-patterns, and how can you use that language to go into it? So that's this section wrapped up. Do you want to have a bit of a break or jump into the next one? What's the sense?
The vote here is a 10-minute break, so back at 1/2 the hour.
Okay.
Great. See you then. Thanks.
Go.
We want to look at the puppy. Joshua. Can you hear me? Joshua.
Yeah, I can hear you. I turned off my video instead of turning on my audio. You want to see the puppies?
Yeah.
Hello, Angel.
Oh my God. There's two of them. Two of them. We can't see. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, they're white shepherds.
Yeah. She loves their frisbees.
Thank you. Right now. Okay, we're ready to go.
Cool. How about the online folks?
They are there. Thanks, thank you.
Cool. Do we have the online people?
No, they're all there. Josh,
Yeah, I'm here.
I'm here.
there.
Cool, got Will.
Can we
All
turn
right.
your videos on so we can see your faces? I mean, can you?
Your beautiful faces.
Yay!
You can see Claudia.
I can see Claudia and Sarah. No, not me. It's beautiful. Okay, let's go.
Sure. All right, so in the time left, I'll suggest two processes. One is playing with the idea of a pattern harvest, and the other one will be doing a bit of a group coaching session. So the pattern harvest idea is, again, leaning into the question of which area are you most interested in at the moment? And so we'll jump into the online and the offline groups again. And so which area do you most want to dive into? And then the question for the group is, what are interesting practices which might be copied in a small chunk? So for example, we were talking about feedback in our session, and I've run a speed backing workshop as a way of introducing people to feedback. So it's a particular chunk which I've written a blog post about and I can share. But it would be, how can you sort of have a placeholder for a conversation? So you write up, you sort of say, this is the thing, and you give it a name and you say a little bit about it. So the people who are considering diving into that area can start to say, oh, that might be a thing I want to research and learn more about, maybe talk to the people who've done it and maybe try and copy it. So that's the idea of the sort of pattern harvest, which we'll jump into next. And then the one after that is a little bit of a hot seat coaching process. Has anyone been part of sort of hot seat coaching or masterminds before? So it's a process I find really useful for peer learning communities. And if you've got people together, and no matter what they're sort of trying to learn, if you hold a space which is like, okay, I've got a question, I want to jump into the hot seat and say, this is my challenge. And it's sort of like a group coaching experience. So one person gets the experience of putting their hand up to be in the hot seat and be coached by everyone else. And everyone else gets the practice and the experience of thinking about their problem. But how do you not just tell them what to do? How do you help them figure it out for themselves? And how can you ask them questions or share from your own experience in a way which is offering up something that might be useful? So they're kind of mirror processes, and we'll do both so you can sort of play with them and see which ones you like as the sort of last few bits of the session. Questions, comments?
I like doing that last process with the person that's in the hot seat sharing their question or their challenge. And when they finish sharing and taking clarifying questions, they literally turn their chair around. And the people that are providing the coaching are providing the coaching, and it allows the person being coached to just deeply listen without reacting or without the people that are doing the coaching being playing to the person in a performing kind of way. So that's just a pattern that I quite like as a riff on the process that you're suggesting, Joshua.
I'll leave that to the in-person people to experiment with, unless the online people have got an idea about how to turn chairs around. But so we split into in-room and off-room for the next 15 minutes to play with a bit of pattern harvesting.
Sounds great.
We can do 20 minutes, no?
Yeah, let's do 20 minutes and let's try to do a couple of them maybe, and then come back at, should we come back at 4 o'clock at the top of the hour?
Top of the hour?
Lovely. See you soon. Good morning. Bye.
I thought of the same thing. All right. Okay, I might just get the sharing on this document. So I figured for this session that actually having a shared doc we can all write in might be useful. And I've got the thing right on top of it. And let's just get this into the chat. Cool. So the purpose of this session is to basically be as relevant as possible to where each of you are at individually with your teams. And so the idea of, if you think about the interventions you're wanting to start to do, we've had Josh put his hand up for feedback, so we can do more feedback if you want to, but we can also go into any topic that interests folks. What sort of patterns are you interested in sort of learning more about?
Something that I've been thinking about with my team is just like developing cadence with different team members. So we have a weekly team meeting, and then we have this old meeting that we do among two of the online course offerings that like we just kind of check in. But I've been finding it to be helpful to do a regular check-in with individuals that are working on other projects as opposed to other groups, kind of like. So there's the in-person group and then there's the online group, and instead of like having the in-person group and online group meet, like I'll just meet with Coogan, and then Coogan and I will each talk about the stuff from our groups, and that's been super helpful. So I've just said, Coogan, like let's make this a weekly thing and we'll see how it goes. So I guess that's kind of a pattern that I think is emerging that will be helpful for me and him, at least among just our structure. I wonder if that's something that will be helpful more generally to other people, like if I should encourage other. Any of you guys comments on that?
Yeah, cool. Your sound just went a little bit, but I got that thing. So just to understand, so the idea of, I just gave it a name of like cross-links between groups, and the cross-links stolen from the holacracy sort of world. But the idea of there are two groups, they don't have that much contact, have a couple of people meet up and just what's happening in your group as a cadence to sort of keep more coherence in the overall structure.
Totally. Yeah, because there's a lot of crossover in what we're doing. I mean, we're all doing education, we're all creating content. And if we just touch base every few days or every once a week, we can make sure we're not duplicating work. And just like, it doesn't need to be the whole team. It can literally just be one person in each. Just get the information.
Cool. No, I love it. And just a question, how many people are you talking about in the sort of the teams and the sizes, just so I've got a bit more context?
So in person, there's 4 people in the other stream now, and then it's pretty much, I'd say 3 or 4 people in each.
So 4 people in person, and you said 3 or 4 people in each other location?
So there's 3 or 4 people for online right now, and then 3 or 4 for in person.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Did you have a question about cadences or things you wanted to dig into?
I guess I just brought that up because I want to know what other people's experience with cadence in terms of how much is too much for certain things and how much is not enough.
Thoughts from others?
So I feel like I have curiosities about patterns across the entire canvas. But the one piece that I feel like I have probably like the least idea of how this works well on is offboarding or firing. It's the one thing that, like, in largely flat teams I've been in the past, it's been kind of reserved for like the remnants of the hierarchy or the management to make those tough calls about that. And it's something that, like, I don't feel like it is pressing for our team in any way, and hopefully it will not ever be, since it's like super downstream. But it's the one thing that I just like don't feel like I've seen any good patterns for, since it seems really complicated to do that as a group.
Cool. Do you want to put a topic in, Will or Donnie, or jump into these ones?
I'll put in a topic, but I want to be conscious of not taking up too much space in this because I'm as much observer. But one of the ones for me is just decision making, and especially I think decision making on big questions, like compensation or offboarding or kind of large strategy. And so like things that impact the whole team, that it's hard to be like really autonomous in relationship to things that are decisions that are umbrella decisions.
Cool. Cool. Guessing that might be Donnie typing.
Yeah. Carrying fit or
I love it.
What's that?
I love the question.
Thank you.
All right, so what I'll suggest for this process is, instead of like long sort of discussions about particular patterns or things that work, the idea of sort of giving something a name and then a few sentences about it, just to sort of surface, hey, what have people seen in terms of what ideas you have about, like, boarding or firing in a flat structure, hiring in a flat structure, decision making for large topics, or different cadences for touching base with individuals. I can definitely rattle off a bunch, but also feel free for others to name some things. One thing that I can name in terms of cadences for check-ins, we did something at Inspiral several years ago called peer stewardship, and it was basically sort of like a round robin of accountability, where if I'm stewarding Susan, then Susan would steward Kate, and Kate would steward Rebecca, and so on. And that everyone has got someone who's basically like, they're not your manager and they're not your coach. Their mission is to steward your experience with the whole. So and often you would have a regular monthly check-in with your steward. And it's not a, what would you say? It's a one-way relationship. So you wouldn't steward the person who stewards you. So often when you've got peer-to-peer catch-ups, you'll say something, you'll say what's going on for you. The other person would say what's going on for them. And then you would check in together. Whereas this is very much you checking with your steward, and they're just about what's going on for you. It's all the attention is on the stewardee. And that's a process which we found worked for sort of a wider community.
Josh, is that typically in addition to peer feedback or instead of?
Separate from. So this person isn't here to give you feedback. They're not here to manage your performance. They're just here to provide you with some support, because in a flat structure, often a really interesting question I found in the world of self-organizing is what's stuff that a manager does that's really useful for people. Because if you get rid of the manager, that stuff won't get done. And some of it is just providing like I'm having all these problems and here's I just want to talk about it with someone. And I found that stewards would often go out to bat for their stewardees a little bit, like they might have some quiet conversations behind the scenes or try and make suggestions about how they could improve their situation, which was, quite supportive for people.
So just to ask possibly a controversial or unpopular question about that, I could imagine that some people are better at the things that a manager does than everyone is, which is why some people specialize in that. So you could imagine a team where I'm getting incredibly good peer stewardship from my person because I have management experience, etc. I'm doing a terrible job at providing it to somebody else, and so I guess given the fact that so much of what we've talked about is actually delineating roles and that kind of thing, how do you balance between expertise on that particular role and also kind of helping people grow into that?
So that's one of the flaws with this, is because most people are stewarding. Everyone can have mixed results, and some people are going to be having great stewarding relationships while other people are having dysfunctional ones. And so another way of solving for it, it's definitely not a silver bullet. Another way for solving for that is to have things like, I've had team counselors before. Like there's a role of like the team counselor who checks in with everybody, and that is something that I found is another way of doing it.
Cool.
I have a tendency when naming roles to sort of give them animal names. So like it's the chameleon counselor or that kind of thing. The more alliteration, the better, I find, with some of the teams I like. Any other patterns or thoughts people want to name around cadences or check-ins? All right.
I guess
okay.
I don't know. Tell me if this doesn't fit into this, especially, Josh, what you were asking for, but it's kind of like keeping an eye on making sure things don't fall through the cracks between different cross. You know what I mean? Like that's the other role of a manager, is to keep an eye on the big picture. And I think if we have lots of cross checks and cadences and check-ins, but there's some ways that sometimes I think that can create a gap in the net. Is that, again, I don't know if that fits in here, but that's a thought that I had.
Yeah. My quick response to that is that flat structures don't remove the need for leadership or remove the need for strategic thinking. And so you can still have people who are focused more on big picture thinking than many other people. And particularly you can have people doing that at different times. Is one sort of immediate response. But that's leading in that way is very different from taking responsibility for other people's performance or experience.
So on the cadence patterns, just a pattern I've seen work well is to create different cadences for different types of check-ins, both singular and group. So, for instance, we have a cadence of every 3 months we do a team retreat, and every month we do, a team alignment, and every week we do a sync or a stand-up or something. Sort of varying cadences for different types of thinking. And then also being very clear in each of those meetings what the purpose is, and ensuring that like somebody is taking on the role for that meeting to ensure that if we kind of go off into another topic, it's pushed to the agenda of whatever the future meeting is that covers that piece. So we don't get into talking about strategy during our stand-up. We're going to talk about that at the end of the month or something.
Cool. Happy to jump into the next topics. I'm aware we've got 8 minutes left. Any patterns people want to name or share in these other sections? I can jump in with some more. So offboarding, this is probably one of the hardest ones. Also one of the ones that I've had the least experience with as well. The main one I'd point to is Morningstar's offboarding process. And so this was mentioned in Reinventing Organizations, and also I've spoken a little bit with Doug Kirkpatrick about this. So, but the idea is that asking someone to leave the organization is something that anyone can do, and it goes through their conflict resolution process. So the same process they have for resolving other disputes is the way to resolve the dispute of Will wants me to leave and I don't want to go kind of thing. And it leverages that same mechanism. That's about all I know about it, and I've always been intrigued by it and never put it into practice myself.
One thing that I like about that framing, which makes a lot of sense to me, and we imitated that in some mock or some draft core that we're looking at, is that it recognizes that it's all kind of a part of a process, that the orientation ought to be towards realignment and kind of coming people back to agreements, but that the ultimate outcome might be that the person, it's not a fit. Way up that chain, then it's an indicator that it's not just a disagreement on direction, that it's actually a fundamental value disagreement. So, yeah, I really like that framing.
Yeah, and to play off of that, something I like about it is that it fits in with kind of like my one of my like core theories of organizational design is that consent is key in every agreement, and so in a way the framing is essentially I'm no longer consenting to work with you, like that, there's sort of a breach of consent there, and so how do you reconcile that? Seems like an interesting way of framing it.
Cool. Yeah. So it's and again, we just haven't had enough of it to sort of do the work of formalizing it in a way. We haven't had to ask many people to leave and so on. And often I find that there's a lot of work which often falls on managers, which is just the work no one wants to do. And like being the person who says, I don't think this person should be here anymore, and actually doing something about it has a lot of personal cost. So that's one noticing. On the decision making, I'm not sure if this is what you were basically, one thing we're doing at the moment, I can't type, is batching our decisions in Inspiral. So we used to have we were using Loomio a lot, which is sort of our tool for decision making. And you'd have people bringing in big decisions, which are like lots of long-term thinking behind it. Some people ignoring them, some people engaging casually. And you'd have other times where people would like disagree with different levels of context quite a lot. And it also put a lot of burden on people to make space in their lives for being part of big strategic decision making. And when you're busy and don't have that context, it often feels like a burden. So we basically started batching our big decisions. And so we've got a 2-week assembly sprint coming up in October, where if you want to bring a big strategic decision to the group, that's the time to do it. And if you want to be part of that decision, you have to opt in to be part of that whole 2 weeks. So not everyone in the group gets a say in that decision. Only the people who opt into that, be part of that decision-making process do. So it's a little bit like a representative jury for the group. And that's probably the current edge of my learning around how to carve out space for long, big, slow decisions in a way which is equitable, but also which doesn't disadvantage the people who've done a huge amount of in-depth context building, and lots of people who are doing sort of like flyby decision making, participating with the same level of blocking power. So that's one pattern might be useful.
Mm-hmm. Pattern I've found useful is to reframe the decision-making process as a design process rather than a democracy process, because most people's experience of democracy is on like at the end point of the design process. So if you're voting in an election on a ballot initiative, you're sort of just voting yes or no on a solution. And I found if you can actually reframe the decision-making process as a design process, and basically there's a few stages, and one of those is essentially everybody like putting forward their needs, which are the kind of design constraints or design goals, and then people offering up solutions, which which you're designing for those needs or goals. Then you kind of get people involved in the decision in a way that that makes them more engaged, and also allows them to say, hey, I'm actually not an expert at coming up with solutions on this, but I can surface my needs, and I entrust others to, design 2 or 3 solutions, and then I can give my input on those, or maybe there's just one solution that comes out of the process. And so it feels less like a democracy and more like a collaborative design process.
Yeah, thanks for that, Micah. It's funny because actually that's what we've been saying for consensus design compensation. Is like the vote is the last thing that we do, and actually if we don't know the decision by the time we get to the vote, we haven't known the design, right? So that's really good. And it's funny, like I hadn't talked down in terms of at the team level, it's a similar thing. Like, and I think it's just a really good message for consensus to like get people to not think about decision making as much as effective design. And I think a design framing is also iterative. Like you vote and then you're stuck with it, versus design, you experiment and you see if it worked, and if not, you go back and figure out why.
Right.
Yeah, thanks for that.
One quick one on the hiring for Fit. I found a principle of easy to join and hard to stay. So the idea of having an easy opt-in, like jump into the organization pretty easily, but then having these processes which are like a current, which are naturally tugging people out of the organization. One of the ones we do for our members, for example, is every 6 months you have to basically re-up your membership and vote and say, yes, I still want to be here consciously. And it's a really useful way for tugging people out of that role. And I found that, so when hiring for people, like doing here's a contract where you come in for 2 months and you do stuff with us, it's naturally going to end. We're going to have to change the terms of this engagement for you to stay longer, is one way of implementing that principle, but there's lots of ways of implementing it. And I find that's a good way of finding Fit.
It's interesting because I remember like in a lot of reinventing organizations that there was the emphasis I think was on hard to join, easy to stay. Right, the idea was kind of build the walls high because once somebody's in, they have the keys to the castle. That's really important.
Yeah, and I think the only reason easy to join works is if you've got progressive layers of membership. Yep. If someone can easily jump into the middle and have the same power and blocking powers as a full member, then it's not a good principle. But if you've got a layered approach where, hey, you're in the outer circle now, you're in a lot of our systems, but you don't have a block, and you don't have the keys to the castle, then it's good caveat.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about because on consensus right now we've got easy to join, almost impossible to remove. That's the current operational theory.
Why is that? Because
I mean, my understanding, because I was on the call this morning about like offboarding, is because in some ways, to be honest, like for the first, right, there is literally there's no coherent offboarding policy. Right? That's one thing. And then the other is that there's not a lot of, like none of the systems are in place for performance evaluation, nothing's objective. And then the other is, I think, honestly, I remember when I started, I was at a town hall meeting last November when I first joined, and Joe was just kind of saying that he didn't know if there were any fireable offenses, short of like hitting somebody. So I think that was a culture element as well.
I see. Well, he used to have a joke, but I think it was just a joke. I always thought it was just a joke.
I mean, except I would say like it was a joke, except when I first came on and I was looking at decision making a consensus, I asked a lot of people, I said, what can somebody get fired for a consensus? And do you know anybody who's been fired? And I literally was here for 2 months before somebody could point to somebody who had been fired. And so I think it was a joke, but I think, he said it's a joke, but my experience was that it wasn't because nobody knew how to offboard anybody. But, yeah.
Fascinating. That's our time, and Susan's calling us back to the room. Happy to jump over? All right, cool. I have... Reminds me of that saying about hurry up and wait.
Just to add one thing, groupthink mentality. I always try to be the devil's advocate, even if it's, you know, just like, I feel like sometimes someone says something in the beginning and everyone's just like, okay. And I'm like, everyone, I always say, like, everyone stop, think of your own thing. That group is kind of.
Sorry, I thought we were ready. We're ready now. All right. Where did you get to? I dropped our patterns and adding patterns, our harvest, into the main sheet that you were working on. It looked like it was a little bit different format than you were using, but perhaps.
I see.
Yeah, but you perhaps take us through, share your screen and take us through, and then we can dip into what we.
Cool. So in our, we had again questions and check-ins. How much is too much and not enough? Particularly, how do you check in with individual team members and what frequency? Had a few sort of name patterns come out there. A really big one around how do you offboard and fire people in a sort of non-hierarchical way. And the one there, I didn't have much information about it, but the one that I read about Morningstar in terms of anyone can ask someone to leave and it goes through a standard conflict resolution process if that person doesn't want to leave. So you're reusing the work on that process. And then there was a lot of reflections around the impossibility to fire people at consensus, or virtual impossibility was a reflection from some folks. Some questions about decision making, and particularly how do you make big decisions which affect everyone, when to do it and how. There was a really good one there about reframing that from a decision making process to a design process, which I thought was quite fascinating. Also, and how do you ensure fit for flat organizations? So we spoke a little bit about some design principles there. That was where we got to in our session. Any comments or noticings folks want to share with the room? Okay, over to Susan.
We just did more of a straight harvest, a bit of a brain dump of what was alive for us in the room. We started with meetings and so we did that for strategy meetings, which is more like strategic alignment. So every couple of weeks, check in, make sure that the decisions that we're making is aligned around our agreements, around our core businesses, and business development. Another pattern is having clear agendas, making sure the calendar invitations have a purpose and the purpose of the meeting clear, and even if there's time to be prepared, to ensure that there's efficient use of time. Joshua also shared, for example, that he doesn't enjoy meetings that are just for an information dump. And we prefer not to attend those meetings, but listen to the recording, creating a harvest afterward. So that was one pattern that definitely works for him. Another pattern is around setting regular times that are kind of sacred, and then we only don't attend emergency. But then that was tempered by this idea of having as few meetings as possible, and really trying as a team not to get into the scenario where our lives are ruled by our meetings. David, can you scroll a little bit so I can? One thing that came out strongly, we had a fantastic day yesterday. It's like I don't even know how to describe it. It was almost like a self-organizing open house where we had different sessions with different topics, and we used different types of facilitation depending on what the topic was. And Sarah noticed in that changing up the style and having a bit of a variety led to inclusivity and ensuring that people's various needs for what types of meeting, how structures like, whether it's participating or watching a fishing pool or sense making, but that's a really good pattern for healthy meeting teams. Being present is one, and then that was very closely followed up by Zoom is a great tool, but we all get distracted and multitask. And, you know, I totally put my hand up to that one. I try really hard to be present on Zoom meetings, but it's a great tool, but Kate shared one time where her screen was accidentally shared and proved that she was actually not being present. Then there was a discussion around meetings and cadence as connection times and an important form of the work, especially when we're remote first teams. We weren't quite sure if that actually fit in the meeting and cadence area or if that was indicative of something more around connection and communication. Then, of course, the normal things like check in and check out and making sure that each meeting ends with some sort of action or closing. Then we started getting into the decision making. If you could scroll up, JB. And this was much more having a very clear experience of what doesn't work and what the anti-patterns are. And even the one that we identified as a pattern, there was a pretty vigorous discussion around that as well. Understanding that probably most decisions aren't actually team decisions. And yeah, so I just found it interesting, the process, noticing that most of what was being surfaced were anti-patterns instead of patterns. And yeah, that's where we got to. Any questions or anything from the room here? Oh. You're muted.
So a lot of the intentions of using this patterns language is around harvesting something which can become a bit of a menu for people, and the idea of putting that up on a wiki so that it can become like a read-write resource for the whole community. And so you can look at some stuff and say, nah, not for me. Some stuff, oh, I might try that, and start to have it codified a little bit in small units that are easy to copy and easy to sort of talk about and think about. And a lot of it's quite common sense for people, but when you haven't worked in this way before, it's pretty hard to have that common sense. So this idea of having a menu of practices or patterns as a way of supporting people to navigate a new way is kind of the intention of it. Happy to jump into some peer coaching practice?
But yeah, let's try it.
All right, so
we can limit it to 10 minutes so that we can do a checkout and just some planning for our next session next week.
Cool. Do folks want to do this as a whole group, or do we want to do it as online, offline again?
Online, offline, please.
Okay.
See you in 10 minutes. Bye.
10 minutes. All right, so 10 minutes, maybe one person, maybe two, and it's really a case of, is there a question that's alive for you at the moment that will serve you and will serve the group? I'm happy to go if no one else wants to. That feels like the least beneficial use of the time. Going one, twice, that's great. Okay then. So the question I've got is really, what's going to be most useful to serve teams from the stuff you've seen today? What bits did you find valuable? Which bits did you not find valuable? If you think about this process a bit more refined and a bit more synced up without the online, offline stuff and people all on the same wavelength, what do you think is the bits to keep and the bits to throw?
Everything around what would be considered normally under people and talent team, HR team.
So that's the bit you liked or not?
Yeah, that's what, because I think that's the most important piece.
Can you tell me more about that? So,
like the hiring, offboarding, onboarding. Like, I feel like traditionally people team, if there were disagreements, would help facilitate resolution. But how do you do that? How do you have a teacher team that internally?
Okay.
I think taking the processes that you basically walked us through today, taking those just right to the team. Like if I could basically just take what you did for us to Academy, that would be an extremely beneficial exercise for Academy. One thing I'm trying to think about how I would do that with our team, just like carving out enough time, because we are like all around the world now, and we are feeling like everybody's bandwidth is pretty maxed out. So just being able to clearly tell the team like, hey, this is it's gonna be a lot of work up front, and we're gonna have to squeeze this in, but like I think the payouts will be huge. So I guess there's a couple of things like taking these processes that you walk us through and then communicating their importance.
If you think about carving out time, what sort of amount feels doable?
I think it's going to be something where we have to start with like an hour maybe, and then see how much of the health check we can get through. And like, maybe we can get most of the way through, and then once people see what it's about, and then it might be easier to be like, hey, like let's take another half hour, 45 and finish this up because this is going to be good for us. So maybe just like start with an hour somewhere.
Cool. I love designing things in small chunks that can be composed. So the idea of like, cool, hour taster, and then here's more if you want it, or here's how you can do it on your own Steam is great. If you did want to actually try an hour with Academy and book it in, we're really happy to sort of just run through a straight health check process.
Okay. And I do have a question about that. Like the health check sheet that you had, is that a document that you can share with us?
Yeah, definitely. I'll share it with everyone as a follow-up to this.
Sweet.
Extending on that, I think, since the model is that folks are taking this back and working with their teams, it seems like as an experienced facilitator, you make it look very easy, and I can imagine some of the conversations not maybe being harder or going in different directions. And so I think structuring in some time and some support materials that say, when you are taking this back for your team, here's the steps you want to go through. Here's, and maybe think of a couple of different models. Like, for example, I think Josh, I think your idea is right on. It's like you do an hour and you have to prove people's interest and show that it's worthwhile, right? It's like if you raise difficult questions, that can be a good thing. No, there's steps we're going to go through to fix it. So some support elements of that and some thoughts about what is the impact people home to their team.
I'm really curious when you say support materials. What do you think is a good support material? Like, is it video content? Is it a step-by-step facilitation guide?
I think a light step-by-step facilitation guide, because it's I can walk out of a training and it's all in my head, but then when I turn around and have to think about how to do it, I can always be like, wait, what was the first part? And what did he say in the middle that will help frame this conversation? So I think that, and also I bias towards text, but I know that that's also my bias. But so potentially maybe even a short video on something like that somebody can watch. Maybe that would be a question for me in terms of other people's styles, what they would want. But definitely I think the kind of, here's all the steps and, a really clear package of all the tools that you used and stuff like that. And if we have mural boards already set up, like if we can have mural board templates even, there's just little things that can, I think, grease the wheels that somebody can take it and it's ready to
go. Cool. And playing off of that, something I found is that there's there's the possibility of this work backfiring if people feel like it's surfaced, people's grievances or things about the process that aren't working well, and then there's no clear path to an actionable outcome. And so what I would suggest with that is, and this is something we're actually figuring out on our own team right now, is to staff this up just like any other project. So that might just be one person, or it may be a couple of people on the team, but basically, create a new project, which is, the organizational design of your team. And then this process will be part of that. Again, sort of like I said with the decision-making thing being seen as a design process, it's like this process is part of surfacing the needs and the pain points and that kind of thing. And then after the process is done, that team, whether it's again one person or a couple people, get together, put together, some proposed solutions, bring it back to the team, and somebody's ultimately responsible for ensuring that something actionable comes out of the process. And some process is tried, even if it's not perfect or something, so that people don't feel like it's just sort of like it's kind of all come out and then nothing has happened with it.
Cool. What I hear there is the idea of you could do like a short taster, and it's like, cool, if you're in, now you sign up for the longer commitment, which means you need to allocate enough resources to deal with the consequences of what gets surfaced through the process, maybe?
Possibly, yeah. But also, I think it's okay if people, let's say the team is a team of 10. And I think it's okay if, 8 of those people feel like they want to continue to be involved in the process in terms of like kind of high level design work, which is what we're doing now, and delegating the more nitty gritty, like, coming up with specific proposals or, setting up the cadence on people's calendars, the actual implementation work, delegating that out to, 1 or 2 people on the team, and just ensuring somebody is really owning it and holding it and making sure that the process continues forward, and kind of delineating between brainstorming and actually doing the work. If that makes sense.
No, cool. I love it. Yeah, that's super useful for me. And yeah, I'd be really keen to spend time with the Academy or any other teams that sort of want to go through a longer, just whole team, let's go through the process together. It's quite fun to see it work.
And I want to ask Donnie and Josh to, like, as we go through this process, like, please give us really strong feedback on, like, what's real, like what will actually get implemented when you take it home. And it might be very different for your teams, but like, it's just really useful to know that, and I feel that not only for this training, but everything that DNA and org dev is trying to do. It's like, I feel like we have a really good idea because people have been clear on what they need, but delivery is the hardest question because bandwidth is so narrow, because things are so spread out. There's lots of questions about what's really going to support people to do it. So. Well,
I struggle so much. I mean, I've been struggling for the last few hours because, and I've actually been slacking with the other turtles because I'm like, are we just that much higher? I was like, I don't believe that TMNT were that much more of a high-performing team than everybody else or every other team, but maybe there's some truth to that because we're all in our mid-30s and we've all done startups before, so like, we have a lot of experience. I don't know, but I'm just struggling so much with how Siri just told me don't worry about it. Did you hear that? That's wild. That is so weird. Do you know what I mean?
When you say struggling so much, like, I'm not sure what the struggle is. Say more.
The struggle is, like, I just feel like a lot of this is we do it without actively thinking about it because it's just what a high-performing self-managed team needs to do to continue to be self-managing and high-performing. Do you know?
No, this is critical. Yeah, this is critical information. I mean, level setting is one of the trickiest pieces, especially at a pilot. Yeah, I think that's great. That's great feedback, Donnie. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think that, and I would say is like, what I know is that there's one of my question marks is who are the high functioning teams within Consensus? And if you'd asked me for a list, I probably would have said TMNT early on, just from what I've seen y'all produce and the process by which you do it. And then there's also a ton of teams that are like, they don't have any of this, you know? And then there's probably folks in the middle. So yeah, trying to level set's really critical.
And I think the other thing is, and the two Joshes heard me say this on the last thing, and maybe we've talked about it, is I just don't know how you fix anything without going back to, it's kind of, you know, if we talked about hiring, if we talked about onboarding, and, you know, right before we went back to the group, we were talking about there was no offboarding process, people didn't know how to fire. To me, that's people and talent. Like, if there's going to be a people and talent circle, that's their responsibility. And, you know, if we never fix that, I fail to see how we're going to fix anything else.
I'm with you. And my provisional theory is that every circle needs to take more responsibility for how it does its own hiring. You know, and I'm 100% with you. It's on that, and it's going to take months for people and talent to gear up to where they need to be.
Yeah, we're working on another way to solve that problem. So if you want to talk about that, there's something we're working on that will fit into TMNT.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that.
Might rock the boat a little bit, but hopefully in a good way.
That's my job.
Yeah, and just something to say on that, Donnie. Yeah, I agree with Will. It's like it's super important that you're surfacing this because we definitely don't want to be like creating curriculum and information that really only just, you know, services sort of the people who are the lowest functioning. And I think you know, at the same time, you know, it almost sort of going back to your remark earlier about kind of like checking our own ego and kind of like being humble about what we know and what we don't know. I feel like even probably the highest functioning teams in Consensus globally, if you look at all teams around the world, are probably, you know, not within the top 100, you know, 1 percentile or something. So there's always more to learn, and then also just as much to teach, right? So if TMNT is just killing it at executing, and you've got your like agile processes down and decision making and that kind of thing, I think org dev would love to work with you on figuring out how do we use what you know so well to cross pollinate out to other teams, so that we're not a bottleneck. And then at the same time, how do we like help you define whatever your growth edge is? Because I'm sure there's always room to grow. So yeah, I think we got to figure out like what is our approach to the super high functioning teams within the mesh right now.
Cool, thanks. And I think, you know, the thing that slows us down is the support we get from the other circles, you know, which is uber frustrating. And we have like numerous examples of that. So sorry about that too.
So just a quick thing, and maybe Joshua, this is something to think about. And I know we need to jump back to the group, but it's like it seems really useful, especially because this is a pilot. You know, with all these folks who are the co-creators, is to maybe do kind of an inventory. Like, what are the things that TMNT feels like they do want to be working on? And one of my other thoughts is, to Micah's point, there may be areas, you know, Donnie, that you guys may not even know you could be improving on, right? And that's the benefit of bringing in Spiral, who's years ahead of us on this, is to be able to kind of say, like, here's an inventory. How are you doing on all these different things? Because then we could dial in elements of it, you know? And that could help us with level setting over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I'm just, super keen to learn, like, what is your learning edge and how can we explore it together? So if you want to sit down and have a session on that separately, I'm more than happy to dive in.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Okay, let's get in there already.
No, they can't.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, great. We had a great time. How about you?
I had a great time. I'm not sure about everyone else.
I did.
Great. Joshua, you want to bring us home? Felt like a jam.
Yeah, so I'd say that's again, when you get people, and we had a really interesting conversation about leveling and about when you have people at different levels, how to help it sync. And I think that for me, the thing I've learned most about education and sort of people growing is that you learn the fastest when you've got folks ahead of you that you're learning from, people alongside of you that you're learning with, and people behind you that you're teaching. And helping to organize all of that can make a very coherent and powerful sort of learning community. And the thing is that no one will be ahead of you on every single topic. Someone might be ahead of you on one thing, but you'll be ahead of them on something else. So it's a very fluid, dynamic relationship, which is highly contextual. And I think learning how to navigate that well, and when is someone your peer and when are they your student and when are they your teacher kind of approach is the thing which will make all this work. So I really appreciate the conversations we had about leveling. Finish with a checkout, Susan? Or do you have reflections from the room?
JB, do you maybe just want to quickly give a very short 1 minute on what the homework is between now and the next session?
Cool. So I think the main homework is to what was valuable from today and what do you want to try out with your team? And starting to talk to people in your team and make a plan about, okay, do you want to do a health check as a group? Do you want one of us to come in and help you do that? Do you want some more support materials? What is it that you would like to take away? And coming back next week with a bit of a sense about this is the area I want to work on. This is the area I want to lean into, and let's really explore that one. So that's the main step between now and next week.
Any questions? Yes, Sarah?
Do you and Kate and Joshua feel like you got what you needed out of the session?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I feel like the next step, my invitation for next step would be for each team to go away and do your own, have a discussion about the 1 to 5s for each of the area, and do a planning poker fist of 5 against each area. So that would be my if I was recommending homework. I know that Joshua likes to be a little bit looser. That would be my recommendation. And then coming to the session next week with a view of, okay, this is what we learned, this is what we noticed about this experience, and this is the area that we collectively want to create an experiment around during the session next Thursday and start to work on. That would be my request. Yeah, Kate's good. Joshua? Joshua's good. Fantastic. All right. Would you like to offer a checkout question, JB, or somebody else?
We have access to the check list.
Yeah, I'll put everything. So we've got a private Slack group called PRIV Team Found .pilot, which I just set up, which I'll invite everybody to now, and we'll just be sharing all the resources there. Kate and Joshua, hopefully in the next 24 hours, will have access to that as well with IT. Yeah.
So Josh, do you want to propose the checkout question? Got it?
Sure. I just go with what's on top for you as you right now, and I'll kick off. I just found it really rich. It was definitely a bit challenging with the tech, but I felt like I really enjoyed the time we spent together as whole groups and little groups, and there was just lots of really good ideas, and mostly I'm just excited to dive in more. Really keen to get to know the teams a bit more and the contexts, and really interested to dive into some of the tricky questions that were raised. Particularly, I just love the diving straight into the, how do you do offboarding in a flat structure, which I think is one of the hardest questions to solve. So that's me.
And you pass to the next person.
Cool. I'll go to Josh because Josh, yay.
All right. I thought it was great just to see these processes in action, to walk through and see how everything works. So I have a better idea of what's to come, and also how to talk to my team about what we're doing here. So that was really helpful. And we'll go to Donnie.
Interested or excited to figure out how we can level up from where we currently are. Like what are we missing that's making us even better? So having dialogue around that, but also still want to contribute to making the core consensus better.
Who are you passing to?
Who's to my left?
Your left is Micah.
Did you say Micah? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Yeah.
Michael.
Hey. I'll echo pretty much everything Joshua said. I thought it was very useful, really interesting conversations. I think a lot of good practical stuff came out of it. The one kind of open question that I have, or kind of the thing that's lingering for me, is that there was a little bit of a mismatch between my expectations, which might have been the wrong expectations coming into this, and what came out of it, which is that in past teams, generally when there's something framed as a project kickoff, the kind of core group brings together stakeholders and then other people who might be kind of drawn on for pieces of the project, and you kind of almost have like an early design session of that thing, brainstorm, that kind of thing. And this felt more like a kind of like a trial run of the work, which again, I'm not complaining about. I thought it was super useful. But I'm also just kind of wondering, is the next meeting more of a place to kind of start to do that kind of early design work, and also like kind of offer up what each person can contribute to the core team working on it. So that's kind of the open question for me, is kind of where that stuff that I'm used to associating with kickoffs happens.
Who's next, Micah? We'll go to Will.
What was that? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
We're just passing.
I thought the information and the training was good. And what's top of mind for me is the conversation that we ended with in our breakout group was, I'm really curious about what supports teams to adopt materials and actually do it. Because it's trainings give great inputs, but what's the output? So, and I think, and then also kind of level setting with the ability for teams that have different levels of capacities. Do they take this training? Do they take, is there a different training, like if folks are kind of mid-level or advanced? So yeah, those are my questions.
Okay. So we're going to try to speak into the mic to do our check outs, but Micah, it seems like you're the only one really struggling, so I don't know how to solve that. We'll try to be as clear as possible. Can you start us, Sarah, and just speaking straight in?
Top of mind is I really like the last session we did, and I think if we had a little bit more time, it would be really useful to do it like around the room. And I liked how we were in general in this session responsive with the tech problems, and we figured it out and did our breakouts, came together, broke back out again, and I thought with the challenges we made it work really well. So thanks everybody for being patient with our tech challenges.
I think I'm feeling much better than I did when we started. This is very hopeful, and I'm excited to see where this goes. I also recognize there's a lot of work to do, and I'm so grateful that I'm not Susan, Kate, or JB, who have to make it all magically happen. So thanks, you guys. High five.
Hi guys, Sam. Top level, I'm feeling good. I am sorry. I feel a little bad that had to be out from 2 to 4. We had the onboarding call with Mary that I had to facilitate, but it went really well. So I'm feeling really good about that, and want to do more exercises on this stuff. I need to catch up. So.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh and Susan. it was tricky, but it was also really fun. And thanks to the in-person team, I thought we moved with a lot of agility, and we communicated really honestly and openly, and really, keen to support this process as it continues with lots of the really good questions that have been raised in this checkout. So thanks.
Yeah, I think it was awesome how we did the offline and online thing, because I think it just naturally flows better. And I'm excited to do the health check on my own team with everyone involved. And yeah, I thought the camp-like activities were a lot of fun.
Yeah, just much gratitude to everybody. Following the technical challenges, which I was like so proud of myself because I thought I had it all sussed, only to be foiled. But again, I think that a big lesson, JB and I had a conversation at the break saying that, lesson for us is that trying to do online and offline probably, in person and remote in the same session probably is something that we don't want to try again soon. So that was a really good learning for me. I feel validated that this co-creation by just diving in feels super generative. And I feel so positive that because we've committed to spending 5 weeks together, that by the end of it, we will have more than we could have expected, more than even I am envisaging at the beginning in terms of solving Will's question about what level is this program, solving Micah's question about do we have all the design elements in place, and building out this really healthy wiki or resource that is going to be built upon every single time we do this process with another group of 3 teams, that sort of by the end of the year, I can imagine having 10 or 20 patterns in each of the categories that are rich and relevant and can just really feed into this. And the last thing that I want to say is I'm projecting this, but I believe that the way that JV and I and Kate work and do our work may seem really clunky and scary and disorganized, but there is something that we're holding here that we've got. So I really appreciate you trusting this and playing along. And how, I just like to leave you with one thing, is thinking about how what we're trying to imagine, amplify, and make possible in the mesh cannot be done by traditional means. We cannot potentiate what's here by doing the same old things. So we are inventing something as we go along, and if we can hold our nerve, what we create will be exactly what this thing needs. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See ya. Bye. Lots of love. Come on, let's get together.
Hey, everyone.
Josh, let's sync up.
See ya.
Bye.
Thanks, JB. Thanks, everyone.
I'll ping you, Josh.
Susan, oh, cohort.